I would probably go to Croatia or Bosnia. I think the role of data is to really help get your customers to value, right? I think at the end of the day, data is how we make decisions, right? It's how we operate, it's part of our operating rhythm. And the goal of data in the customer success journey is to be able to, again, bring your customer on a journey to help them achieve their objective. You want to make sure that you're getting your champions that are going to be hopefully in the room reviewing that before you go and present to the executives. The worst case scenario is you launch or you get to a launch phase, they don't adopt, you don't say anything, and then it's 3 months before the renewal, 1 month before the renewal, and you raise your hand. At that point, it's too late.
This is the Launch Station, the only place you need to look for all things onboarding, implementation, and customer success. Tune in for insights from industry experts every week.
Welcome, folks, to yet another episode of the Launch Station. Today, we're going to be talking about how to use data for your onboarding and customer success narrative. And we have the right expert for today's conversation with us, Nikola. Nikola is the founder and CEO of a company called Matic. And prior to Matic, he had an interesting journey. Did work as an implementation specialist at one point in time, moved on to LinkedIn, where he was part of an insights team, which is working on data and narratives for customer success, sales, solutions teams. I'm going to let Nikola actually do justice to that, stint he did at LinkedIn and just maybe introduce what motivated him, what, got him to get started with building Matic.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me on the podcast. So a little bit about the journey. Actually, as you mentioned, I was at Blue Nose prior to LinkedIn, which was a customer success software startup, and wore a variety of hats as you do at a startup, everything from product to onboarding, implementation, and got to work very, very closely with our customers to onboard them and help them get to value. And so when I joined LinkedIn, I had joined a team called Insights, specifically in the sales solutions business line, where I had worked on building out internal tools and narratives that our sales and customer success teams used. So our mandate was to really, how do we better leverage our data to help enable our sales and customer success teams? So Matic was actually something that the genesis of Matic was something that we had experienced at LinkedIn. So as you can imagine, data was a key part of all of the different touch points that our sellers and our customer success managers would do in the life cycle. So pitch decks, business reviews, renewal decks, business cases. And we would have these templates, and then there would be placeholders that would say, hey, okay, Pri, make a copy of the template, let's say business review. And then we would have notes that say, go to this place to go get this chart, go to Nick, he'll pull this data. And we had built an internal tool that already existed that automated that process. And I had the chance to rebuild it. And it really kind of got me thinking, okay, how, probably other companies are experiencing a very similar pain point where they want to be able to tell the right story with data in the different touch points, whether it is in the onboarding phase, implementation, whether it's in the adoption phase or renewal. How do we help companies scale that? And so that's how Matic came to be, was something that I had worked on at LinkedIn.
Awesome. That sounds great. And, I've seen Matic, exciting product you've all built there. So congrats on that. Before we jump into learning more about how, people should be using data in their narratives, a quick icebreaker. If you could travel anywhere, where would you go?
Oh, man, it's been a while since I've traveled with everything that's happened over the past 4 years and managing a startup. I would probably go to Croatia or Bosnia. So I'm initially I was born in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and I've got a lot of family in Croatia and Bosnia. And I haven't seen them in a really long time, given the pandemic, and probably would go there and see some family. I know it's probably a boring answer, but that's probably where I would go.
Cool. I haven't been there either, so maybe someday, it'd be good to visit.
There you go.
Cool. So let's get to the meat of our discussion. What's the role of data in customer success presentations?
Yeah, I think the role of data is to really help get your customers to value, right? I think at the end of the day, data is how we make decisions, right? It's how we operate. It's part of our operating rhythm. And the goal of data in the customer success journey is to be able to, again, bring your customer on a journey to help them achieve their objectives, right? So if customer has objective A, B, and C of why they purchased your product or service, well, hopefully you can use data to showcase to them how they've achieved those objectives. And so it really is around storytelling. You don't want to just do a data dump for the sake of just showing data. You want to be able to translate that data into a story that helps them realize how they've achieved their objectives of why they've purchased your product or service.
It would be great if you can actually give us some examples of how you saw that happening at, say, LinkedIn or any other place you're familiar with, or maybe from some of your customer stories.
Yeah. So a concrete example of how to do that, how to use data. I think a particular touch point in which customer success does a lot of this is business reviews, right? And so usually you have you're including data within that process on how they're using your product or service. But again, just showing the data, you want to be able to showcase how that data ties to value, and then how that value then ties back to those objectives. So setting up some sort of a narrative around that is repeatable, that you can do not just with customer A, but you can do with customer B, C, and D is a great way to be able to scale. And we saw that at LinkedIn, but we also saw that at Blue Nose and also within our customer base and the market that we talk to.
Got it. One of the things I think we all struggle with is getting the right data to make our points, to sort of tell the stories the right way. It always, I've seen people turn up at a QBR or a EBR, and then the discussion turns into a debate about the data. How do we avoid that?
Yeah, so I think twofold. Let's be tactical here. Let's talk about an EBR where you're on with an executive, right? So I think one of the things is pre-wiring, right? So you go and create a narrative, or you create a business review deck. You want to make sure that you're getting your champions that are going to be hopefully in the room reviewing that before you go and present to the executives, right? So, they can give you some insight into like, hey, stay away from this, or hey, double down on this. This is what they care about. So I think part of it is just the process of, who you get involved in helping you create these narratives, right? So I go and create a business review for one of our customers. I'm going to go, before I go and present, talk to maybe my champion, or talk to the folks that we work with every single day, to be like, hey, I want you to be a part of this process. We'd love to have you give me some feedback on this narrative, and does this data, does this ROI check out, and where do you feel like your executives are going to push back, right? So I think part of it is pre-wiring with your champions and stakeholders that you work with on a continuous basis.
Great point. I guess, having that element of doubt removed, and the focus becomes, okay, we know everyone agrees on the data. If there was discrepancies, It's been figured out beforehand. Makes so much sense. Great tip there.
And just to kind of add to that, like like I said, you want to be able to, if your champion is invested, or if your admin or whoever you're working with is invested and they're part of that building process for that narrative, they can jump in as well, especially if the executive does push back on, let's say, an ROI metric or a value metric. They can kind of jump in and say, hey, here's why we believe this is to be true, and here's why, we agree with the value that has been realized through the product.
Got it. And there's obviously different kinds of data and metrics that people collect to use depending on their own individual product context. But have you seen any patterns on what kind of data, makes the best kind of data to track and evaluate customer health, ROI, to showcase and, with the customer to build those narratives?
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of created this, like, I don't know, you've probably heard of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think there's a very similar analogy, but with data, right? So at the bottom of the pyramid, I think you have kind of telemetry data, just basic account information, right? Which is probably what you're collecting in the pre-sales process, in the onboarding phase, like, Tree, why did you purchase Matic? What were the things that you really care about? What are the things that you're hoping to accomplish over the next year with our solution, and what can we help with, right? So you have that as kind of the groundwork, right? The second step in the pyramid is usage data, right? How are you using the product or service, right? And in the onboarding phase, it's less about usage data because you're just wanting them to adopt the product. It's more about, like, hey, binary, like yes or no. Did we check off these milestones? Like, if you have a technical product, did we connect to data? Where are we at? Are we blocked? Right. But once you do get to that usage and you start collecting that usage data, that is kind of the foundation then to be able to get to the top of the pyramid, which is then ROI and value, right? Which is then saying, how do we translate the usage data to value that is then mapped back to those objectives of why they purchased the product. So obviously there's a lot of data sources that you work with, from stuff that is in Salesforce that is maybe a little bit more qualitative as well as quantitative, as to BI tools like Tableau, Looker, Mode, right, where you're storing maybe a lot of the usage data and you're seeing a time series view of it, as well as support, right, and onboarding tools where you have maybe some of that additional information.
Great. What's the best example you've seen of people scaling the use of data really well in like a SMB or mid-market sort of scenario?
Yeah, I think a big part of like the long tail, where you have a large book of business, SMB, and you might not have as many bodies, right? The ratio is a little bit off. Is, I think you need to figure out, one, what is the story that you want to tell? What is the data that you want to actually share with these customers? What's important to them? So what may be important to mid-market enterprise might not be important to SMB, right? So I do think you kind of have to take a step back and really try to understand what are you trying to achieve with showing certain data points. One of the things that we've seen with our customers is this concept of like a one pager. It's been pretty big. So you're not going to have a sit down meeting or an EBR, right? So you still want to be able to give them something that showcases adoption, value, and ROI. So putting together like a one pager that does that, where you send it out on a monthly basis. And I think the companies that have done this really well are the ones that have a pretty cohesive story and then are distributing it on a consistent basis, right? So I might not have a meeting with you, but the hope is that, hey, I'm sending this out on a monthly basis. You see it. And if there's a red flag, it maybe causes you to raise your hand to then book some time with you, right? Because you can't meet with every single customer. But the hope is that these data-driven narratives that you're sending out can hopefully lead to you having meaningful conversations when needed.
Got it. That's super useful to understand. I think one of the challenges I've seen personally for many companies that sell to teams is adoption, right? Yeah. And when there's adoption data, there's two possible narratives. One is, hey, the team doesn't like the tool, or the team is not, taking to the tool. And the other is change management failed. Whose responsibility is it? Or, hey, customer champion, are you not capable of driving the adoption? How would you recommend, if you're at this point where adoption is a struggle for some customers, and that's what the data is telling you, what's the best way to approach that situation in a QBR, or if you want to do something at scale, how do you go about doing it?
Well, the answer I'm going to give you is probably not just in business, but I think in life in general, is the sooner you break the news, the better, right? So if you're delivering bad news, let's say in the first example that you gave, like, hey, adoption is not there, they're not taking to the tool, it's better to communicate that early on, right? Because then you have time to fix the problem. The worst case scenario is you launch or you get to a launch phase, they don't adopt, you don't say anything, and then it's 3 months before the renewal, 1 month before the renewal, and you raise your hand. At that point, it's too late. And so I think there's what I see a lot of the times is people are scared to deliver bad data, in this case, like low adoption. And I would say if you do it early on, it can actually be a catalyst for you to be able to have those hard, productive conversations on how to turn it around. So that's probably my biggest feedback is, hey, especially in the implementation and onboarding phase, if you have these goals set and you have these milestones, if they aren't met, that's great. Just talk about it and be like, hey, we are not getting the adoption. I wanted to flag it. I want you guys to get value out of the product. Can we please, sit down and figure out what we need to do or diagnose why people aren't adopting the product, right? But it has to happen early.
Got it. And what would you say would be, there's obviously a lot of effort that needs to go into digging data for specific accounts. Often, if you don't have, like, there's the common data and then there's bespoke analysis sometimes we want to do for enterprise accounts and so on. CSMs are often stuck trying to find time with their engineering team or business analysts in the company to say, hey, I need this data for a presentation tomorrow. What are some strategies to work around that problem, or how you've seen the most successful CSMs deal with the situation?
Yeah. Data and ops are probably like the scarcest resource at a company, right? Because they don't just support sales and customer success. They probably support all the functions within an organization. And I think a big part of, is really articulating the why, like why you need this data. And you have to be able to bring whoever you're working with, your stakeholder, whether it's customer success ops, whether it's analytics, you got to bring them on a journey and you have to have them realize, hey, I need this data because it's going to impact renewals or it's going to tie back to like a company-wide objective, right? And so I think you do have to bring your stakeholders on that journey and have them realize, because look, they have a million tasks and they have to prioritize, just like you have to prioritize accounts on who gets love and who gets attention. They're having to prioritize data needs. And so you have to be able to arm them with as much context and as much, you got to build a business case, right? Just like you do with your customers, of why they need to prioritize this. So that's probably where I would start, is showcase to them why this data is needed and the impact that this data is going to have with customers, with renewals, whatever tangible goal the company has, right, that you can tie it back to.
Got it. And any best practices you can think of for using data to demonstrate value ROI to customers?
Yeah, so I think one, again, I've probably said this like multiple times, the objectives do matter. So don't just showcase like an ROI, like the customer needs to care about it. So, if you wanted to show, hey, here's active users, well, great. What does that translate to, right? So you need to be able to tie it back to objectives that they care about. Benchmarking is also something that I think goes a really, really long way to contextualize ROI and value, right? So, hey, you guys are crushing it in this area compared to other customers that look like you, or a benchmark doesn't even have to be a vertical or company size. It could also be time-based. Hey, your data here compared to last year, compared to last quarter, that's a benchmark, right? Here's how you guys are doing. So that's another way that I think is good to basically showcase how a customer is doing compared to other folks within your customer base.
Makes a lot of sense. And I've seen how benchmarks and scorecards and stuff like that can go a long way, and the customer valuing that QBR, saying, hey, okay, I'm going to learn something about my industry or competition, others, how others are doing. How do you recommend companies use data to create scalable customer onboarding and success narratives?
Yeah. I think in terms of, I think part of it is you can kind of look at what the final output needs to be for those scaled narratives, right? Like kind of identifying, I would probably spend a lot of time there. But then also, what are the triggers that causes somebody to get that narrative, right? So, hey, if they go from the onboarding stage to adoption stage, whatever your life cycle is, that is the signal that we need in order to know, hey, we need to go and generate this content for this account. So I think part of it, taking a step back, is really mapping out your customer life cycle and then identifying what is the entrance and exit criteria for those stages to then dictate what content you're generating for and for which accounts, right? So you kind of have to start there, really defining that before you get into scale. And a big part of it too is you mentioned this before, data is not perfect, right? And so narratives is the same way. You want to iterate, just like you iterate on your product and your roadmap, you want to iterate on your narratives. So before you invest the time, go and test out the narrative with a few of your customers, right? See how they respond, see what feedback they give you, because what you think is cool might not be cool to your customers, right? Same thing with product. You may think this feature is going to be a game changer, and then you talk to someone, they're like, that's not what we need, right? So same thing with narratives. And then I think once you have that identified, you have those triggers, you have the narrative identified, then you can go ahead and scale those things.
Awesome. Great inputs, Nikola. We move to the next section of our podcast. Couple of quick rapid fire questions. One is, can you share a book or a movie that inspired you?
A book or a movie? Okay. I'll go a recent book that I read. I'm a big soccer fan, so Carlo Ancelotti, big coach, Real Madrid, AC Milan. He wrote a book on quiet leadership that had a pretty big impact on me, especially this year. On, you don't have to be the most vocal, you don't have to be the most charismatic person in the room to be a good leader, right? And I think that's changed my leadership style a little bit, because I think what society and what the norm is that you have to be this outspoken person to be viewed as an effective leader. And I think Carlo did a really good job in his book showcasing how that doesn't have to be the case. Like you can be an introvert, you can be a quiet person to be able to do that. So that's probably one that I'd recommend.
Very interesting. Should definitely give it a read. What's one customer onboarding goal you have for 2023?
One customer onboarding goal that we have for the year. I think it's probably in line with most B2B SaaS companies, is how do we continue to reduce the time to value, right? So how do we go from a month and a half? How do we go down to like a week, right? One day. So that's always something that's like really, really top of mind from an onboarding standpoint.
Got it. And what kind of narratives have you all crafted during the onboarding journey? What do you generally talk about with customers? What data do you try to present to them?
Yeah, I think it's more the qualitative stuff about like the objectives that they're looking for. And then we do a lot around key milestones and what the next 30 days looks like and what we need to do to get to the success, right? So if the goal in our product is to onboard a template, right, we need to connect to a data source, we need to go and create the dynamic content, we need to tag the template, we need to test it. And so we have those milestones and we show that data to see like, hey, who's hitting it, who's not, and how are we getting to that milestone.
Awesome. And feels like there's a lot of dependencies on customers to get live. How, what do you do to get them, hold them accountable and get the job done?
I think it's expectation setting, right? Like I think a big part of it is just being very upfront as like what their role is and what their responsibilities are. Like you gotta outline that from the get-go. That even starts in the pre-sale motion, right? Like, I think one of the things between the relationship between sales and customer success, sometimes sales will say a few things to get a deal across the line, and then customer success has to deal with it. So we try to be one team and we really try to focus on setting the right expectations for our customers. And then two, I think you have to have playbooks around escalation, right? usually the person who buys is not the person who's implementing, right? And so you want to make sure that you're keeping the buyer who signed the contract, the economic buyer, and the decision maker. You want to keep them in the loop so that if there are blockers, or if that person you're working with is not meeting deadlines, you're using that person to nudge them and get them to meet those deadlines, right?
Perfect. One last question for the episode, Nikola, which is, I know you already talked about how, one tip for leaders around pointing us to the book, Quiet Leadership. But what other inputs or advice do you have for leaders in customer success, onboarding, etc.?
Yeah. I think one of our core values is compassion. And I think compassion is one of those things that the world needs more of these days, especially with everything that's been going on. So I think leading with compassion is a good one. So a lot of stuff has been going on. There's a lot of macroeconomic events that are going on, right? You hear about layoffs, you hear about all these things. And so, taking a step back and really trying to understand how your employees, where they're at, what they may be feeling, right? And just listening and trying to put yourself in their shoes is probably a good thing right now, given what we have going on. So I say lead with compassion. That's something that I learned from Jeff Weiner, who was a CEO at LinkedIn when I was there. He talked a lot about compassion and how to lead with it.
Amazing. Great point there. Great thing to keep in mind and remember in all of our interactions. Thank you so much for all the inputs, Nikola. It was great having you on the show.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.